the subjugation of Sarosh in Saga 945 30. Next, the Dark Angel's 4th Expeditionary Fleet reported to take part in the enforcement of the continued Imperial compliance of the planet Sarosh, officially codified as Sigma 517, an effort which had formerly been commanded by an officer of the White Scars Legion. The Saroshi, ruled by a bureaucracy, had recently expressed their interest in becoming part of the Imperium, and the Imperials were eager to allow them in, believing that these people seemed to express the same secular beliefs as they did in the Imperial truth. But the Saroshi, without mentioning it to the Imperial expedition of course, secretly worshipped chaotic entities in the warp they called the Mekalim, and saw the anti-religious stance of the pre-Heresy Imperium's Imperial truth as unsuppressed evil. The Lord High Exactor, the leader of the Saroshi bureaucracy, denounced L. Johnson and the Emperor to the Primarch's face aboard the Dark Angel's flagship, and the Lion responded by ramming his power sword through the fanatical Saroshi leader's body. Unknown to the Dark Angels, the Saroshi had secreted a nuclear device aboard their shuttle, intending to assassinate the fleet's entire command structure, including L. Johnson. However, Luther and a junior librarian named Zahariel managed to eject the shuttle into space, causing only minor damage to the Dark Angel's flagship. After this incident, Luther, Zahariel, and 500 other Dark Angels were sent back to Caliban in disgrace for allowing an enemy to get a nuclear device aboard the Primarch's flagship. Their official task was to oversee the recruitment of new Space Marines into the Legion from the Calibanite population. The Compliance of Byzanthus, from circa the mid-900s M30. A Dark Angel's expeditionary fleet under the command of Chapter Master Maria Estellan discovered the far-flung human-settled world of Byzanthus during their exploration of System DX-619. A Vox signature, feigned or perhaps even non-existent, had brought the Dark Angels here, the merest chattering murmur against the background radiation of the universe. Another Dark Angel's fleet under the command of Chapter Master Belath had joined Estellan's only 2 solar weeks earlier in the Calcabrina system, on orders from Lionel Johnson that Belath add his forces to the expedition. Estellan had never met him before, but this was not surprising. The massive influx of warriors into the First Legion following the rediscovery of Caliban meant that there were many Dark Angel commanders who had never met each other, tossed together on task forces and in war zones all across the galaxy. That one such chapter commander had been dispatched to assist Estellan was curious for the simple fact that there had been little enough for Estellan's chapter to do, and additional forces were unlikely to change that. When the 2 chapter masters finally met face to face, they differed in their approach of what action should be taken against the newly discovered world. Estellan advocated making a peaceful overture to the planet's locals in order to foster good relations. Belath advocated a more aggressive approach to subdue the planet through force of arms. Estellan cautioned Belath that they should only use force when all other forms of diplomacy had failed. The younger chapter master did not agree with the senior commander's assessment, but deferred to his position. Upon first contact with the local populace, Estellan's landing force was engaged by the local military, which sustained substantial losses while the Dark Angels took only minimal casualties. Receiving a looped message from Byzanthus' ruling global council, the Committee of Nations, Estellan hoped to make amends for the inadvertent conflict. He asked the committee's constituent national governments to treat with the Imperials through the Committee of Nations, and hopefully forge a common fate for the whole planet. The younger Balath refused to consent to this course of action. Stellan and one of his commanders agreed to meet the Committee of Nations in their chambers and explain their purpose. Stellan explained to the committee's representative the benefits of becoming a part of the newly forged Imperium of Man under the beneficent rule of the Emperor of Mankind. But these negotiations were interrupted by the unheralded arrival of Chapter Master Balath. 10 massive armored Terminators suddenly teleported into the committee chambers and opened fire on the startled delegates, massacring a good portion of their number. Balath then inquired of Stellan whether he should order the rest of his fleet to attack or whether they should teleport back to orbit. Stellan was filled with a mixture of rage and incredulity, his hand forced by Balath's insubordination as Stellan reluctantly ordered the assault. He warned his younger counterpart that the blood of all who died on Byzanthus in the coming war would be on his hands, and that he would not let his actions go unpunished. The younger chapter master merely dismissed his senior commander's threats and proceeded to inform Stellan that he had already sent word to Caliban of what occurred on Byzanthus and that he would soon learn the consequences of disobedience. The Siege of Barakan. In the 1900s M30. This was an Imperial compliance campaign carried out by the Dark Angels during the Great Crusade against the Orcs on the world of Barakan. A notable battle of this campaign was the defense of Firebase Angiago. A chapter of the Dark Angels was cut off by the Greenskins and trapped at the Firebase for 18 solar months. By the end, the beleaguered Astartes were fighting off the alien assaults with fists and pieces of sharpened steel scavenged from bombed-out strongpoints. But through it all, Brother Nemiel never wavered. He taunted the Greenskins relentlessly and exhorted his brothers to acts of ever greater defiance in the face of insurmountable odds. When a Greenskin's crude axe shattered his knee, he grabbed the beast by one of its tusks and kicked it to death just for spite. When the last line of defense was broken, Nemiel stood his ground in the face of a massive Xenos champion and fought an epic duel that had given the chapter time to launch a counterattack that finally exhausted the last of the enemy's strength. The next day, when relief forces finally managed to fight their way through the firebase, Nemiel stood on the ramparts and cheered with the rest of his brothers. It took several solar minutes before he registered the slaps on his shoulders and back and realized that the chapter was not cheering for victory, they were cheering for him. Not long after, Nemiel's chapter voted unanimously for him to take the place of Brother Redemptor, Barthiel, who had fallen during the darkest hours of the siege. The suppression of the Gordian League. From circa 998 M30 to 5 M31. This was an Imperial compliance action carried out by the Dark Angels during the 200th year of the Great Crusade against the shield world of the Gordian League, a confederation of human worlds who were allied with degenerate Xenos. During this campaign, the Dark Angels' High Command received word that War Master Horus and his Sons of Horus Legion had renounced their oaths of allegiance to the Emperor, along with Primarch Angron's World Eaters, Mortarian's Death Guard, and Fulgrim's Emperor's Children. They also received word of the atrocity committed against the doomed world of Istvan III, when Horus ordered it to be virus-bombed, which rendered it a lifeless dead world. The War Master knew that the Emperor would respond with all the force he had available. L. Johnson believed the Dark Angels' deployment to the Shield Worlds was part of an effort to scatter the Imperium's most loyal servants as far as possible in order to minimize the number of loyalist Space Marine legions Horus would have to face at any given time. Even so, a strike force of 7 full legions posed a dire threat to Horus' survival as they made their way to meet the traitors at Istvan V. L. Johnson's forces were too deeply enmeshed in the shield worlds to respond quickly to Horus' treachery. The best estimates of the Primarch staff indicated that it would take them nearly 8 solar months to conclude their offensive operations, even on an emergency basis, and reposition themselves for a strike against Istvan V. Even if they could move more quickly, Horus's agents would be able to alert the War Master in time to organize a counter-strike. However, L. Johnson believed that a small, hand-picked force might accomplish what an entire legion could not. He issued orders for many of the Dark Angel's reserve squadrons to resupply and prepare for immediate deployment to the Tanagra system. A primary target was to secure the Forge World of Diamat. They could not afford to let the War Master acquire the substantial supplies and ordnance needed to fortify the world of Istvan V against the approaching Loyalist strike force. L. Johnson personally commanded the expedition to Diamat, with a battle group comprising 15 warships. Secrecy was vital, as the Primarch was aware that the War Master's agents were more than likely tracking his movements. The Horus Heresy, from 5 to 14 M31. Knowing the Dark Angels and their Primarch would remain stubbornly loyal to the Emperor, the War Master Horus ordered them to the eastern fringe on the far side of the galaxy. Hampered by distance, ambushes set up by the traitorous Night Lords and demonic attacks, the Dark Angels could not ultimately reach Terra in time to participate in the defense of the Imperial Palace, the culminating battle of the Great Galactic Civil War. The Battle of Diamat in 5M31. When word reached the Dark Angels of the Istvan III atrocity, Lionel Johnson and the 1st Legion were bogged down fighting a campaign against the Gordian League. Therefore, the Lion led a small war fleet of 16 vessels against the Forge World of Diamat in order to seize Ordinati heavy siege engines and deny them to the traitors. He encountered some resistance from vessels loyal to the traitor cause, as well as traitor Imperial Army forces and the Sons of Horus company on the planet's surface. The Lion ordered the destruction of the planet's primary forges, which annihilated the traitor forces in a great conflagration and denied Horus Diamat's crucial manufacturing capabilities. In the battle's aftermath, the Lion encountered the Iron Warriors fleet, led by Perturabo, who were on their way to Istvan V to pacify the treacherous War Master. Unaware of their true loyalties, the Lion unwittingly handed over the captured Ordinati to be used against Horus. The Thramas Crusade, from circa 7 to 9 M31. During the Horus Heresy, the War Master Horus sent Conrad Kurz and his Night Lord's Legion on a campaign of intentional genocide against the Imperial strongholds of Herolda and Thramas in the Aegis sub-sector of the eastern fringes, thus protecting Horus's flank and delaying the Dark Angel's Legion from reinforcing the Loyalists blocking the traitors' path to Terra. This bitterly contested campaign dragged on for nearly 3 standard years. In an attempt to sway his brother Lionel Johnson to Horus's cause, the Night Haunter left a deep void beacon in the patrol path of one of the Dark Angel's Outrider vessels. The beacon was set to transmit coordinates in advance, so that the two Primarchs could meet and parley on the planet of Tsagawalsa. Nighthunter wanted to break his former brother either mentally, physically, or both to obtain his objectives. The Primarchs were accompanied by two warriors from their personal honor guards to the parley. The meeting began amicably enough between the two as they conversed with relative civility. This amity lasted only until the Nighthunter slandered L. Johnson, and in return, the Lion struck his former brother. This melee further degenerated into an all-out brawl between the two sides. As the Nighthunter strangled the life out of L. Johnson, one of the Dark Angel's honor guardsmen ran his sword through the Nighthunter's back, saving his Primarch's life. Eventually, both legions sent reinforcement in response to this incident. Each side dragged away their respective Primarchs from the scene of the combat. Both survived this brutal confrontation and went on to continue the contest between their legions for control of the Aegis sub-sector. The Battle of Perditus in 8M31. When the Dark Angels received intelligence from an astropathic message from the nearby Perditus system, they acted accordingly and moved to intercept. Upon arrival, they interrupted the solar month-long conflict between the Iron Hands 98th Clan Company, led by Cassalier Loramek, and the large Death Guard contingent, led by First Captain Callus Typhon. Both sides had been fighting over an ancient self-aware technological device known as the T'Challa engine. This device was a part of a triumvirate of similar sentient devices, another being the Ouroboros, and the third, unnamed one, which, when combined, could create temporal rifts that bridge space and time. On its own, the T'Challa was capable of precise and extremely efficient warp jumps. Faced with the prospect of fighting the entirety of the much larger First Legion fleet, both sides retreated from the planet Perditus' surface at the Lion's request. Wary of both sides' motives, especially First Captain Typhon's, the Lion prevented the device from falling into the Death Guard's hands for his own nefarious ends. The Lion then proceeded to serve his own ambitions and requisitioned the device for his own use. Lion ordered the destruction of Perditus, much to the consternation of both commanders. The Dark Angel's Primarch used the T'Challa engine to make a warp jump, but during their sojourn through the Materium, the First Legion was beset by demons. The Lion reinstituted his legion's librarians to fight these nefarious warp-spawned entities. As this was in direct violation of the Emperor's decree absolute abolishing the librarian corps of the Legiones Astartes made at the Council of Nicaea, this caused a dispute within the Legion that eventually came to a head when the enraged Lion slew Chaplain Nemiel, who had opposed the use of the librarians. At the height of the battle, he encountered the greater demon of Tzeentch known as Kairos Fate Weaver. The demon attempted to convert the Primarch to the cause of the ruiner's powers, but failed miserably, as he offered nothing to sway the Lion to their cause. The Lion told the foul creature that absolute loyalty to the Emperor was reward enough, and impaled the twin-headed Lord of Change through its black heart, asking whether the demon had foreseen his actions. The defense of Nagathar in circa 9M31. Severed from the main body of their legion by the unleashing of the Ruin Storm, a strike force from the Dark Angel's Legion found shelter in the Nagathar system, which had become a safe haven for several loyalist splinter forces, the most important being drawn from the Imperial Fists. The many loyalist fractions banded together to defend Nagathar from a powerful incursion led by the Word-Bearers, who had hoped to prey on the system's millions of inhabitants to fuel yet another of their sorcerous rites. The Xana Incursion in 9M31. Intelligence reached Terra that the renegade Mechanicum forge world of Xana II on the western fringe of the Imperium had reached an accord with the traitor forces to supply the Warmaster Horus's armies with its vast output of arms and material. The bargain was sealed with the delivery by Xana II of a number of newly created Ordinatus grade weapons undergoing their final field tests. In what was effectively a suicide mission, a hand-picked force of Legiones Astartes, including many Black Shields, in this case Space Marines who had chosen to remain loyal despite their parent legion's treachery, was dispatched under great secrecy to destroy the war machines and drive a wedge between Xana II and the traitors. With the help of the Dark Angel strike cruiser Dark Sovereign and its legionaries, the Loyalists were able to secure 2 powerful Ordinati and destroyed a third, temporarily delaying the alliance between Xana II and the traitors for a number of standard years. Hunting the Night Haunter in 9M31. Utilizing the sentient Tzeentch engine a second time to make a rapid and far-reaching warp jump, the Dark Angels were able to execute a meticulously planned ambush on the Night Lord's fleet while it was in transit across the sub-sector that saw the back of the Night Lord's legion broken and their Primarch mortally wounded after having faced his brother L. Johnson once again in mortal combat. Thanks to the skilled coordination and superb execution by the Lion, the Night Lord's fleet was devastated, losing dozens of capital ships and approximately 1/4 of their Legion fleet to the Angels' assault. Unfortunately, the remainder of the Night Lord's fleet fled the Dark Angels' wrath, taking their critically wounded Primarch with them before the Lion could finally end his wretched life. Directing a second ambush on the regrouping Night Lords, Conrad Kurz reawakened from his medically induced coma and boarded the Invincible Reason with several of his most elite warriors, including 1st Captain Jago Savatarion and his elite Atramentar Terminators. The ensuing battle ended when Kurz fled to the lower decks of the massive Dark Angel's flagship, and the few surviving Night Lords, including Savatarion, were taken prisoner. The Night Haunter, however, remained on the loose within the bowels of the mighty vessel, and continued to wreak terror and chaos amongst the mortal crew. He also killed every hunter-killer team sent by the Lion to hunt him down. After losing several squads of Dark Angels, the Lion himself took up the hunt for Kurz, stalking him throughout the Invincible Reason for the next 16 solar weeks. However, he could not find his elusive brother Primarch. The arrival at Ultramar and the establishment of the Imperium Secundus in 9M31. With the torrential ruin storm summoned into existence by the Wordbearers at the Battle of Kalth raging across the galaxy, blocking out the light of the Astronomicon and causing warp travel to be all but impossible, the Imperium was effectively cut in half. The Dark Angels came to the realization that they were unable to return to Terra to assist in its defense, even with the aid of the Tzeentch engine. Miraculously, they locked onto the beacon of the strange alien device known as the Pharos on the world of Sotha, which guided the First Legion's fleet safely through the warp to the realm of Ultramar's capital world of Makridge. There, they were greeted by Robert Gilliman and Sanguinius, whose Blood Angels Legion was also guided to the realm of Ultramar by the Pharos. The 3 Primarchs were instrumental in the foundation of the Imperium Secundus, as a means of continuing the fight against the traitors and securing the Emperor's great work. Guilliman proclaimed Sanguinius as the rightful heir to the Emperor, and declared him the new ruler of Imperium Secundus. Lionel Johnson was made Lord Protector of this new empire of humanity and commander over all its military forces, a title that was similar to that of War Master which he had once so craved. Unfortunately, the foundation of Imperium Secundus was marred, and Conrad Kurz escaped from the Invincible Reason and rampaged across Macridge, intent on spreading as much terror and chaos as he could. Eventually, both Guilliman and the Lion confronted him. Their attempts to kill him were unsuccessful, as the Night Lord's Primarch had laid a cunning trap. He brought down an entire chapel upon the two Primarchs through the use of planted explosives and fled the scene. Guilliman and the Lion were only saved through the direct intervention of the loyalist Iron Warrior's warsmith Barabas Dantioch, who was communicating with Guilliman at the time of the attack through a portal that was opened by the Pharos. On instinct, the warsmith reached through the portal and pulled the two Primarchs to safety on Sotha. The Battle of Zapath in 11M31. Feeling directly responsible for the Night Haunter's rampage on Macridge, the Lion continued to obsessively hunt his wayward former brother for the next 2 standard years. In 11M31, he eventually was able to trace a slim lead on Kurz's whereabouts to the Zapath system, which had since fallen to the forces of the Word Bearers and World Eaters during their Shadow Crusade campaign. Fareth Redloss, the voted lieutenant of the Dark Angels Dreadwing, was charged with leading the hunt for Conrad Kurz upon the world of Zapath. The Dark Angels quickly uncovered the horrors perpetrated by the Word Bearers to power their dark rituals. Eventually, the Dark Angels took part in multiple engagements against the forces of both traitor legions, which culminated in Zapath's capital city of New Mentis. The traitor forces were utterly annihilated by the victorious Dark Angels, and the world was left in the care of its surviving population. The Exile of the Lion, circa 11M31. While continuing his obsessive hunt for the elusive Night Haunter, Lionel Johnson and Robert Guilliman continuously clashed over policies, especially in regards to the security of the Imperium Secundus, and how best to deal with the emergence of rebels on Macridge that the Lion was certain Conrad Kurz had something to do with. Following the suicide bombing of an Astartes convoy, the Lion used the First Legion to establish martial law on Macridge. Certain that Kurz was hiding within the rebellious Illyrium region of the planet, the Lion advocated the use of a massive orbital saturation bombardment of the area to ensure Kurz's death. Facing resistance from both Emperor Sanguinius and Guilliman, the Lion instead opted to deploy his legion's Dreadwing in order to flush out Kurz and the rebels. During an attack on the city of Alma Mons, the Lion finally cornered the elusive Night Lord's Primarch, and the two came to blows. After a brutal confrontation, the Lion eventually emerged victorious, and questioned his brother why he had turned away from the Emperor, to which Kurz simply replied, "Why not?" Kurz went on to explain that there was a monster in his head that he could not stop. Though he finally had him at his mercy, the Lion couldn't bring himself to kill his brother, and instead pummeled him again. The Lion ripped his backpack from his battle plate and then lifted him over his head, brutally bringing him down across his knee, breaking Kurz's spine, paralyzing him. The Lion brought the grievously wounded Kurz before Sanguinius and Guilliman to stand trial. A triumvirate was held where Kurz defended his actions, but refused to admit his guilt. Since each of the Primarchs had been created to perform a specific function, he claimed that he was merely acting according to his own nature, and therefore had committed no crimes. The Night Lord's Primarch further divided Guilliman and the Lion by accusing the latter of secretly ordering the orbital bombardment Illyrium in direct violation of Guilliman's orders. Enraged, the Lion sought to kill Kurz, but was halted by the words of Sanguinius and Guilliman, who snatched L. Johnson's Lion Sword and broke the blade across his armored thigh. L. Johnson was furious, but Sanguinius dismissed the Lord Protector of the Imperium, ending the triumvirate. The Lion was subsequently banished from the Imperium by Sanguinius and Guilliman. Taking their leave, the Dark Angels withdrew from Mackridge only solar hours later. Standing in the chamber of the Tuchalcha engine, the Lion brooded over recent events as he questioned his actions over the course of the last few solar decades. The banishment of Luther, the death of Nemiel, as well as other decisions he had come to regret. As the Dark Angels made their final preparations to depart back to Caliban, the Lion ordered the Tuchalcha engine to teleport himself and Holgin, Deathbringer, the voted lieutenant of the Deathwing, back to Mackridge. As Sanguinius prepared to execute Kurz for his crimes, both the Lion and his lieutenant teleported directly into the chamber and told Sanguinius to stop. As troops entered the room, demanding that the Lion surrender, L. Johnson explained his reasons for the intrusion. He reasoned that Kurz had the ability to see precognitive visions of potential futures, and repeated the Night Haunter's claim that his death would one day come at the hands of an assassin sent by the Emperor. If this was true, the Lion reasoned then it was proof that the Emperor was still alive. Sanguinius knew the Lion's explanation rang true, as he recognized that his own precognitive visions of his inevitable death would also eventually come to pass. When Guilliman demanded to know what would become of Kurz, Lion knelt before his two brothers and promised that he would be Kurz's jailer. Passage of the Angels, from 11 to 13 M31. The campaign of vengeance against the traitor legion's home planets during the Horus Heresy, that was later remembered as the Passage of the Angels, also known as the Crusade of Vengeance, was a brutal loyalist counter-offensive spearheaded by the Dark Angels Legion and led by Lionel Johnson. They wreaked havoc across the southern Imperium in a campaign of revenge and extermination. The campaign was designed to both punish the traitorous forces of the Warmaster Horus and destroy their military assets in the region. This systematic annihilation of resource-rich worlds deprived the Warmaster and his forces of precious material he needed to maintain a lengthy siege of the Imperium's throne world of Terra. By taking such drastic measures, the Lions sought to prevent the Warmaster from establishing a second front against Terra. The Lion authorized the usage of forbidden weaponry from the Age of Strife held in the Dark Angels Legion's armory, which resulted in a trail of burning and scorched worlds that were loyal to Horus left in the Loyalists' wake. The Second Battle of Davin in 11M31. The world of Davin, where Horus first fell to the temptations of chaos, was destroyed in the first act of the Dark Angel's judgment upon the traitors. After the destruction of Davin, the ruin storm began to dissipate, allowing the Dark Angels to embark on a crusade of extermination against traitor worlds across the vast reaches of the Imperium's southern segmente. At the Lion's direct command, long-forbidden weapons from the earliest days of the Great Crusade, dating back to the Age of Strife, were loosed upon those who turned from the Emperor, burning whole worlds from existence. The Angels' crusade of extermination was designed to both punish the traitors and destroy their military assets. The Death of Chemos in 12M31. Chemos, the home world of the Emperor's Children Legion, came under direct attack by the Dark Angels during the passage of the Angels campaign. The Angels' armada smashed through the Emperor's Children's System defense fleet, leaving behind them only the smoldering wrecks of venerable 3rd Legion warships and frozen corpses floating in the darkness of the void. The invasion that followed saw the Dreadwing deployed to the surface of Chemos en masse to engage the Emperor's Children garrison and plant seismic devices of immense potency in key locations on the planet. The Emperor's Children, though vastly outnumbered, fought fiercely in defense of their homeworld and inflicted heavy casualties upon the invaders. But ultimately, it proved a futile effort. The Dreadwing was merciless in the prosecution of attacks on strategic targets and scoured enemy strongholds of all life using weapons born of humanity's darkest nightmares. With their objectives completed, the Dark Angels returned to their fleet in orbit and remotely detonated the seismic macro charges. A chain of catastrophic explosions racked Chemos and split its tectonic plates apart, creating kilometers-deep canyons that swallow the dying planet's glittering metropolises into their cavernous depths. At the height of this cataclysm, the Dark Angels' fleet initiated the orbital bombardment, launching a spread of cyclonic torpedoes at predetermined weak spots across the world's surface, each strike piercing the weakened crust and detonating within Chemos' planetary core. The once proud homeworld of the Emperor's Children broke apart, sending colossal slabs of planetary debris tumbling through space. The Chemos system was declared perdita, and warning beacons promising swift retribution upon any trespassers were placed around the system's boundaries before the Dark Angels departed to continue their crusade of vengeance. The liberation of Saronicon in 12M31. An expeditionary force composed of elements of the Ultramarines and the Calth High Guard Solar Auxilia regiments of the Imperial Army under Ultramarines' command was dispatched by Lionel Johnson to pacify the high worlds of the Saronicon Gulf. The Ultramarines and their support troops engaged with rebellious Imperial Army regiments and rogue fleets of the World Eaters Legion in a prolonged campaign across 3 star systems. Eventually, the Sons of Guilliman emerged from this conflict bloodied but victorious. However, their victory came at the cost of their expeditionary force being left behind by the Dark Angels, who moved on to the next stages of their relentless campaign of extermination against the traitors' worlds, free from the scrutiny and increasing unease of the Ultramarines and their tactics. The Fall of Luth Tyre in 12M31. The Dark Angels' fleet reached Luth Tyre, a key mustering world for the traitors located upon one of the most stable warp routes in the southern Imperium. Lionel Johnson could ill afford the obliteration of such a valuable prize, and ordered his Knight Praetors to deploy their orders and capture the world in the name of Terra. The Dark Angels made planetfall in the wake of an orbital bombardment so intense that it fused the planet's rolling white desert into plains of jagged glass and set the upper layers of the atmosphere ablaze. Luth Tyre's Iron Warriors garrison and their Death Guard allies mounted a valiant resistance against overwhelming enemy numbers. But one by one their strongholds were blasted to rubble and utterly destroyed by the Dark Angels. Isolated Iron Warriors' forces mounted desperate last stands among the ruins of shattered fortresses and broken refineries across the world, with the death toll continuing to rise for the invading loyalists. During the fighting, a combined Death Guard, Iron Warriors, and Dark Mechanicum force mounted a daring attempt to reach Luthtire's tertiary spaceport at the planet's south pole. They fought their way through massed loyalist forces and packs of raging ambols in a desperate bid to reach the spaceport's warp-capable craft, which they used to escape into the void, leaving Luthtyre firmly under Imperial control. The Siege of Inwit in 13M31. Hungry for the strategic prize that Rogal Dorn's homeworld represented and the industrial wealth of its surrounding stellar pocket empire, a vast traitor fleet led by elements of the Emperor's Children and roving forces allied to the Warmaster Horus attacked the worlds of the Inwit cluster. Each piecemeal assault was repelled by the garrison of Imperial Fists and loyalist Solar Auxilia forces stationed in the system, who in turn were forced to fall back from their forward positions in clashes of growing intensity. Eventually, the loyalists retreated to Inwit itself, where they were besieged by the numerically superior traitor fleets. The Imperial Fists lost dozens of warships in desperate attempts to break the blockade and seek reinforcements. However, the frigate Astral Majesty managed to break through to a Mandeville point and successfully translate into the warp. The heavily damaged warship of the Imperial Fists was forced to exit the warp near the system of Amaranthine in the galactic south, where, by chance alone, it encountered a scout element of the Dark Angels fleet. The surviving Imperial Fists were taken before Lionel Johnson to request the assistance of the Dark Angels in lifting the siege of Inwit, but they were denied. The Sons of Dawn were instead conscripted by the Lord of the First Legion to be part of his crusade of vengeance. They reluctantly joined their forces with those of the Angels and aided them in the prosecution of their campaign, leaving behind the people of Inwit to face their enemies alone and without aid. The Thassos Incident in 13M31. A Dark Angels flotilla was sent to investigate rumors of an unidentified fleet lurking in the isolated Thassos system in the Segmentum Tempestus. The Dark Angels were ambushed by a reaving warband of the Night Lords as they arrived in the system and suffered severe losses. The Night Lords were denied the killing blow when an irregular fleet of warships bearing the sigils of the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard emerged from the asteroid field around the world of Thassos Secundus and intervened. Caught between the surviving Dark Angels vessels and the newly arrived Shattered Legion's force, the Night Lords hurriedly withdrew from the Thassos system, abandoning the smoldering wrecks of several warships of their legion. Thirsting for a chance to avenge the terrible losses they suffered on the killing fields of Istvan V, the Shattered Legion's force was offered fresh supplies of arms and munitions and was subsequently tasked by Lionel Johnson with scouring the nearby systems of remaining traitor forces. Deliverance Conjunction 13M31. The vast fleet of the Dark Angels reached the moon of Deliverance in the Kiava system. There, in the fortress of the Raven Guard, Lionel Johnson met with his brother Primarchs Corvus Corax and Leman Russ. The Lion was quick to question Corax's absence from all the major fronts of the war since Istvan V, but his ire was put to rest by Leman Russ, who pointed at the survival of his own legion as proof of the Raven Lord's continuous loyalty to the Emperor. Fully recovered from the wounds he suffered in the Trizolian system, Leman Russ declared that he and all Space Wolves warriors on Deliverance would join the Dark Angels in their crusade of obliteration. To appease the Lion's call to arms, and knowing well the fate that befell those who did not demonstrate loyalty as the first Primarch expected it, Corax offered vast quantities of munitions and supplies from the forge fanes of Kiawa to the Dark Angels and Space Wolves, including thousands of newly created suits of Mark VI Corvus power armor. Hesitant to commit any significant portion of his depleted legion to what he saw as an undertaking of excessive violence and needless waste, Corax assigned only a small expeditionary force of his Raven Guard to accompany the Dark Angels in the next stages of their campaign. Few in number, but bearing the experience of 1,000 battlefields between them, the Raven Guard departed Deliverance with orders to eliminate key enemy targets ahead of the Lion's onslaught in order to save entire worlds from complete annihilation. The Ghosts of Zhao Arkad in 13M31. Ambitious to carry the momentum of their Primarch's campaign forwards, an impetuous contingent of the Dark Angels reached the Forge World of Zhao Arkad in the galactic southwest and proceeded to make planetfall at its principal forge fanes. The Dark Angels exited their drop pods and orbital assault transports to encounter warriors clad in the crimson armor of the Thousand Suns, previously thought to have been destroyed at the hands of Leman Russ and his Space Wolves Legion during the burning of Prospero. Emerging from the psi mists obscuring the forge fanes, the Thousand Suns did not open fire on the Dark Angels. Instead, they proclaimed their loyalty to the Emperor and offered to parley. Under orders from the Lion himself to subjugate the traitor Forge World and believing the Prosperine warlocks to be lying, the Dark Angels initiated offensive operations across their landing sites on Zhao Arkad. Determined not to allow Zhao Arkad to suffer the same fate as their devastated homeworld Prospero, the Thousand Suns unleashed their psychic might and the seemingly endless tide of battle automata against the invaders, inflicting severe losses on the Dark Angels. The First Legion forces launched 3 successive counter-assaults in order to push the enemy out of the ever-shrinking landing sites established by the Angels, but each failed to achieve its goals. Hundreds of loyalist lives were lost when Titans from the Legio Xetobiax intervened to put an end to the ill-fated invasion. The remaining Dark Angels hastily withdrew to their fleet and enforced an orbital blockade of Zhao Arkad, awaiting further orders from the Lion. The Siege of Barbarus begins. In 13M31, a vast loyalist armada broke from the warp into the Barbarus system, spearheaded by Lionel Johnson's Gloriana-class battleship, the Invincible Reason. Alongside the fleets of the Dark Angels sailed the warships of the Raven Guard and the Space Wolves, led by their Primarch Leman Russ. The Loyalist Armada smashed through the scarred few remaining Death Guard warships that stood in defense of their homeworld to obliterate the inner system defense platforms and orbital stations and, at last, reach Barbarus's orbit. Swarms of Death Guard Stormbirds and Thunderhawks rose from the planet's surface to mount futile attack runs in a desperate bid to give their brothers on the ground time to prepare for the coming invasion. But they were swiftly shot down by massed formations of interceptor craft launched from the bays of Raven Guard cruisers. Sheltering behind the multiple layers of void-shielded defenses, the Death Guard and their allies looked up as the pale sun of Barbarus was eclipsed by scores of falling drop pods and swarms of orbital landing craft that brought the wrath of 2 Primarchs and warriors from 3 loyalist Space Marine legions. Reaping what was sown in 13M31. The crusade of vengeance against the traitor legion's home planets that would come to be known as the Passage of the Angels came to the adoptive home of Mortarion and the Death Guard. The defenders of Barbarus had no illusions as to the certainty of their fate. The forces arrayed against them were the rival of any expeditionary fleet of the Great Crusade. Yet their own strength was no trivial thing. A garrison of grim Death Guard, shattered but unbroken force of iron warriors and an ambassadors of Horus's own Sons of Horus Legion stood their ground against the fury of the Lion, the Wolf King, and the Raven Lord. Such a confrontation could only end in extermination, but the toll upon the Loyalists was great. This was the homeworld of the Reaper and his grim 14th Legion, and they would not sell it cheaply. The Primarchs of the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves had made planetfall, and if the traitor forces were to lose Barbarus, then perhaps cutting the head from one of those legions would balance the scales. While the forces of the Lion and the Wolf King arrayed themselves upon the plains of Orthria, full of rage and vengeance, the Raven Guard made ready their aircraft and jump troops. The Gene Sons of Corvus Corax had neither the numbers of their allied legions nor their thirst for blood. Their goal was not to make an example of the traitor legions, but to end the conflict swiftly and decisively. Amid the toxic smoke of the crash site, the forces of the Loyalist attackers surged towards the massed lines of the traitor sortie. A broad line of Loyalist armor and Dreadnoughts pounded the defensive emplacements with lass, bolt, and missile fire, and from within the armored hull of his land raider Spartan, Leman Russ emerged. Eager to heap vengeance upon the Sons of Horus for their part in the Wolf Cull on Yaren III, the Primarch of the Space Wolves and his Tartaros armored Hearth Guard hurtled towards the ranks of Sea Green legionaries. Yet at the last moment, the Sons of Horus withdrew, their bolters hammering into the ranks of the Space Wolf Terminators as the gap left in the traitor lines was filled by the stalwart advance of the Death Guard. As the traitor forces hurled bolter fire, chem munitions, and the barrage of ordnance at the Falca Fenrica, the first Primarch and his inner circle knights brought their swords to the War Master's Gene Sons. Cutting deep into the center of the traitor lines, the Dark Angels made good their oaths of vengeance and censure. The presence of 2 Loyalist Primarchs, fighting only paces apart, was enough to shake the resolve of even the fatalistic Death Guard. None dared approach, for to do so was to meet certain death. Yet to withdraw would only invite chase from the Wolf King, becoming prey for the most feared of predators. Castellan Praetor Vroghorn, master of the Barbarus garrison, knew that such hesitation could cost the traitors their opportunity to retaliate should it be allowed to fester too long. Taking up his relic war axe, the Death Guard Castellan broke ranks and charged the Space Wolves Primarch. Their moment of indecision broken, the defenders' lines surged toward the Loyalists, enveloping Russ. The Death Guard's charge was not without some success. They cut down the last of the Tartaros Terminators who accompanied Leman, leaving him to stand alone on the battlefield, at least for the moment. As the ponderous Terminators made their retreat, 2 among their number dragged a bloody figure through the mud. Castellan Praetor Vroghorn lived, but only just. Grievously wounded, the Death Guard commander clung to life with the grim tenacity of his legion. Agents of the Lion's final sanction against the Death Guard homeworld, the Interrompters of the Dark Angels Dreadwing, were deployed to every war zone on Barbarus. Upon the plains of Orthria, a squad of these grim annihilators was dispatched to render the traitor forces to naught but ash and dust. As they advanced into the enemy lines, they were met by the dour Iron Warriors holding ground before the Bastion's void shield generator. The whole of the Horus Heresy played out in that moment amongst a hell of superheated plasma gas and the cracking boom of the Iron Warriors' shrapnel shells. The warriors of what had once been brother legions cut each other down. The badly wounded Death Guard Praetor made his way through the Bastion's underground network of tunnels, past defensive redoubts, and through choke points until he arrived at the munitions control node. He had been dragged to the Bastion gates by the remaining members of his cataphracti retinue before they turned and met the vicious charge of Leman Russ. They had brought Khorne the time he needed to arm the grim payload that awaited the Loyalists. The brother Primarchs pushed on towards the Orthrian Bastion, the way of their advance cleared by Arcus warheads, storm cannon shells, and searing las, neutron and volkite beams. As they approached the entrenchments before the Bastion gates, a rumbling tremor shook the battlefield. A moment later, the muddy earth erupted upwards in a series of massive explosions. In a final act of spite, the Death Guard Praetor had detonated the chemical payload housed within the depths of the Bastion. Caustic fire and choking chem smoke belched thickly from craters across the Loyalist lines, momentarily throwing warriors from the three attacking legions into disarray. Yet the Lion and the Wolf King could taste victory and would not let it slip from their grasp. With sharp commands, the Primarchs drove their legions onward towards the enemy fortification. In their wake, they left only devastation. The Dark Angels and Raven Guard armor picking off the remaining stragglers of the traitor forces. With their leadership broken and their traps sprung to little effect, the traitors' defense of Barbaros was collapsing. Dour Iron Warriors held the void shield generator that protected the Bastion from orbital bombardment, as well as the Bastion gates, but their numbers were dwindling, and they were surrounded by enemy units from all three of the attacking Loyalist legions. Those defending the gates made vain attempts to hold back the combined assault of Lionel Johnson and Leman Russ, but even with the injuries the Primarchs had received, the Iron Warriors were cut down in mere moments by the angry demigods. With the defenders' desperate sortie smashed aside, the Loyalists had claimed victory over the plains of Orthria and stood ready to breach the Bastion. Like Fulgrim's homeworld of Chemos, Barbaros was doomed to fall in the passage of the Angels. The fury brought to Mortarion's foster world was beyond the defenders' capacity to withstand. With bastions and subterranean bunkers breached across the planet, Loyalist strike teams purged the vaults housing the Death Guard's remaining chem arsenal before collapsing the fortifications with graviton bombs and seismic charges. When the last of the Loyalist forces had returned to their orbiting void ships, the orbital bombardment began. A vast storm of planet-killing munitions hailed down from the Dark Angel's fleet, splitting the poisoned world asunder. As the conflict on Barbaros came to a close, the Primarchs looked to their next targets. The Lion and Leman Russ parted ways, carrying on their campaigns of vengeance against the traitors as they each saw fit. Russ's remnant fleet struck out to bring the Emperor's executioners to traitor forces located close to the galactic core. The Lion's main force made its way toward the Spinward West, smaller Dark Angel splinter fleets enacting their Primarch censure throughout the region. In their wake, The shattered remains of fallen Barbarus hung in the void, silent as the grave. The destruction of Nuceria in 13M31. During the siege of Terra, Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels Legion, received a shared vision with his traitor brother Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, of the extermination of Nuceria, Angron's hated homeworld. Its already shattered and depopulated remains were utterly destroyed and wiped from existence by an orbital bombardment commanded by the fleet of Lionel Johnson and his vengeful Dark Angels. The news of Nuceria's destruction renewed the hope of the besieged loyalists, as this meant that the forces of the Dark Angels, Space Wolves, and Ultramarines were finally en route to reinforce the besieged throne world.